So this talk is a collection of opinions from various papers and conference speakers. So it's quite an opinionated talk. I'll be sharing my observations that I made during my doctorate journey. And this talk is just meant to be an overview of the dementia research world. One thing I've noticed is that there are 4 recurring themes in dementia studies. Firstly, dementia is quite a nebulous concept. And so because of this, there will be many side plots. There is a cycle of progress, search in research, and then fatigue. And every time we are better able to characterize or quantify each facet of the disease, there is a research search, and there's a need to step off and rethink the issue every so often. So I'll first elaborate on what I mean by the disease is nebulous. So this slide gives the pivot points in the timeline in the last 100 years of Alzheimer's disease, how it progressed in research. Now, when I talk about Alzheimer's disease, I also mean other neurodegenerative diseases in the elderly, because Alzheimer's disease is the most common disease. So for elderly dementia, and that's why I tend to focus on it more. So this is Alzheimer's. He moved from Frankfurt to Heidelberg to do research with his mentor, Emil Kraepelin. What was interesting in my journey was I moved from Frankston, Victoria to Heidelberg, Victoria. Both are in Melbourne to do research with my research supervisors, Christopher Rowe and Victor Vilimangi. And this was the patient that Alzheimer's described. He presented the pathology studies of this patient in a small talk, something the size like ours today in 1906. And this is what he described. So in the top pictures, there are extracellular A beta amyloid plaques. And in the bottom picture, there are intracellular tau tangles. This is Emil Kraepelin, his mentor, who described the disease in his textbook of psychiatry in Germany in 1910. So in 1910, Alzheimer's disease became an entity, and diagnosis was at death. So there was no enthusiasm in the 1900s. In 1933, there was a large autopsy series that just showed some loose correlation between intracranial pathology at death and dementia, and people did not actually think much about dementia in those days. People did not live long enough to develop the manifestations of the disease that we know of today. So just to give you an illustration of how nebulous the disease is, let's think about a healthy individual who meets with some disease sometime in his life. And let's say that the disease is like a blocked coronary artery that's very amenable to intervention cardiology. Today we can pop the artery open and the patient can live a very normal life. Or what if the patient has some hormonal imbalance, and today we can balance the hormonal imbalance and the patient can lead a very normal life. But what if we are managing patients with dementia? We do a lot of time-consuming things to compress the morbidity to the last part of the patient's life, and we try to cushion the impact of the disease. But at the end of the day, we are still not sure if we have actually done much for the patient, and that's how nebulous dementia work still is. So in the mid 1900s, there was no research on dementia at all. In those days, there was a very strong move against ageism, and that led to the institutionalization of the aged. So, and people started to live a lot longer. So the problem of dementia became more visible to people in 1966, the Cambridge group proved that there is correlation between the degree of brain pathology and dementia skills. So it was realized then that dementia or Alzheimer's disease was not the inevitable consequence of aging. It took another 10 years before Katzman argued that dementia or Alzheimer's disease is not actually part of the aging process. So in another way to put it, so let's say if you plot a curve of the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in a community, and you look at the prevalence of people with Alzheimer's type brains when they died, the curve roughly parallel each other, and there's a lag of about 15 years. It took another 8 years before there was clinical consensus. So in other words, the consensus was that if someone had a memory impairment plus another cognitive domain deficit that was progressing such a way that they lost function, that was considered to be Alzheimer's disease. So this Alzheimer's disease became a clinical entity in 1984. So in just my very brief historical presentation that I've given to you, you can see a search of research, and then there's fatigue, and then the search again. And I want to talk about the next search in the last few decades, and then the fatigue again. And with that, it leads me on to talking to you about biomarkers. So current dementia research is mainly driven by amyloid cascade hypothesis. And what this hypothesis suggests, as demonstrated in this graph, is that when amyloid builds up in the brain, that leads to synaptic dysfunction, which leads to tau-mediated neuronal injury, that causes brain atrophy, which affects cognition, and eventually there is a functional loss. And we can actually track amyloid accumulation with CSF A beta today and amyloid PET. We can track synaptic dysfunction with FDG PET and functional MRI. We can track tau-mediated neuronal injury with CSF tau. We can look at brain atrophy with MRI as well as CT brains. And of course, cognition we can track with cognitive skills and clinical assessments. And this is just an example of a biomarker in dementia. We look at hippocampal atrophy. Now, when the hippocampus is of good volume, we can see that clearly. When the hippocampus is of low volume, we can see that clearly, but somewhere in between is kind of murky. Anyway, Bruno Dubois from France came up with a new nomenclature for pre-Alzheimer's disease. He suggested that patients with symptoms plus any biomarker should be considered to be someone along the pathway towards Alzheimer's disease. The person on the right is Bill Klang, on the left is Chad Mattis, a psychiatrist and a radiologist, respectively. And they took a dye that binds to amyloid and tag it with a radioactive carbon-11 tracer. And what limited them from using it for imaging was because of the positive charge that prevented this compound from crossing the blood-brain barrier. The reason this compound is called Pittsburgh compound B is because compound A did not work. But after over a decade of trial and error, they managed to come up with PET amyloid imaging. And we can see that PET amyloid imaging in vivo has very good correlations with what we know in histopathological studies. And PET amyloid imaging from histopathological comparison studies is highly sensitive for amyloid plaque in the brain. It can accurately distinguish Alzheimer's disease from frontotemporal dementia and can predict progression for people with cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's disease. And these are just some different neurodegenerative diseases and what the PET imaging shows. The reason why dementia in Lewy bodies has a positive scan is because over 70% of patients with dementia in Lewy bodies also have concurrent Alzheimer's disease pathology. So this is a slide showing the prevalence of people in Melbourne and Perth with Alzheimer's disease in the community. And the ABLE group in Australia image healthy patients, or well, actually they're not patients, they are just healthy people who came for studies. And they found that the prevalence of significant plaque buildup in the brain also parallels the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease with a lag of 15 years. So we can actually trace preclinical Alzheimer's disease today using amyloid PET scans. And we have shown that patients with high amyloid plaque burden in the brain eventually develop cognitive impairment and brain atrophy. So why don't we scan everyone? Well, the problem with carbon-11 is that it's got a very short half-life, so only very specialized sites where they can synthesize the compound on site can they do a scan for one patient. But if you want to scan many more patients, you have to have a compound that lasts longer in terms of radioactivity. So the way to do it is to tag the compound with fluorine 18. So what has been done is people have taken carbon-11 PIP, and so take away the methyl group that is radioactive, tag it with fluorine 18, and that's how you get fluorine 18 PIB. Take away the sulfur, nitrogen, hydrogen, and methyl group, tag it with fluorine 18 and using a polyethylene glycoside chain, and that's how you get fluor beta band. Take away a carbon atom from the middle benzene ring and replace it with a nitrogen atom, change the middle benzene ring to a pyridine ring, the name from band to pair, make $500 million doing so, and that's how you get fluor beta pair. And so all these compounds do work. And so today we can actually determine if someone is going to get Alzheimer's disease using these scans. So we can now consider someone to have preclinical Alzheimer's disease. So the top images show participants in a disease-modifying drug trials, and using these amyloid scans, the patients at the top, the two top images are people who received monoclonal antibodies against the amyloid plaques, and those at the bottom receive placebo, and over time there's amyloid buildup in those who had placebo, and there was a reduced plaque burden in those who had the monoclonal antibodies. In post hoc analyses of the initial studies, they did show that if you can reduce plaque burden in the brain, you can slow down cognitive decline. So that led to very expensive billion-dollar multiple phase 3 studies, which took several years to complete. And unfortunately, nothing has worked. Everything failed. And then the whole world was hit with COVID. And so once again, there's fatigue. After all that progress search in Alzheimer's and dementia research, there's once again fatigue in the field. So as I said, the current dementia research is driven by the amyloid cascade hypothesis, but everything now is limited because there's no treatment available. So if there's no treatment available, why do you want to spend money doing research? Anyway, research shows that, what I'm trying to show you is that history shows that research will search again. So if we can appreciate the challenges faced when doing research, it will position us to better capture the next research wave when it occurs. So I've written a paper documenting the types of challenges faced in Alzheimer's in dementia studies in in the Alzheimer's disease textbook edited by Jolenta and Kobutsky. I may have butchered their names. I apologize if I've done so. Anyway, moving on to the third theme. So the third theme is how we can better characterize and quantify each aspects of the disease and the challenges faced, and that's what my book chapter was about. Due to shortage of time, I will just tell you the highlights. So basically, using the 1984 criteria, when it went to histopathological comparison studies in regional sites, the criteria was only 70% accurate in predicting that someone truly had Alzheimer's disease. And even in very specialized centers, the accuracy was only 85%. So if we are not diagnosing patients properly, how are we going to come up with a proper drug for them? Patients who want to know why they are declining are more likely to enroll themselves into drug trials, and because of that, they are more likely to decline. So just be aware the type of patients that come for drug trials are different from the normal person in the community. And also, it took me 7 years before I could get my longitudinal results to write up my thesis for my doctorate. So over the 7 years, there was turnover of research staff, obviously, and there was also dropouts. And cognitive testing is not is both a science as well as an art. It's not perfect. And of course, if there are available treatments, then countries will have to develop infrastructure and upskill clinicians in using biomarkers. And that leads me on to the fourth theme. We need to take a step out and rethink every so often. So we've come full circle now. The amyloid cascade hypothesis has driven the drug trials and nothing has worked. So is the amyloid cascade hypothesis not correct? Has it been a distracting side plot? So I took data from my doctorate research. Basically, what my research showed was that those with a high amyloid plaque burden at baseline, after 2 years, many of them converted to Alzheimer's disease. And after 4 years, it was clear cut that they developed Alzheimer's disease. And what I did was I took serial scans, and those with an increased amyloid burden after some time, which indicates that they must have had fibrillogenic oligomers of A beta, and which are soluble. And this soluble A beta will eventually form plaque. So if there was an increase in uptake over serial scans, it suggests the presence of these A beta oligomers. What I showed was that increase in tracer uptake over time did not predict Alzheimer's disease. So let me just slow down and say it clearly. So the participants with high amyloid burden at baseline develop Alzheimer's disease over time. But those with increased amyloid burden over time did not develop Alzheimer's disease. Rather, it predicted all-cause dementia. So how do you think about this? So we need to take a step out to just rethink what exactly is going on here. Do we need to tweak the amyloid cascade hypothesis? So when I was holidaying in India, I had I had a eureka moment. Extracellular A beta plaques that Alzheimer's described, because it's non-toxic in vivo in the oops, I wonder what happened there. So basically, if somebody accumulates amyloid plaques extracellularly in their brain, although that's pathognomic for Alzheimer's disease, that actually buffers that cognitive decline. And this is quite interesting because what we see in clinical practice is that non-Alzheimer's disease dementia do have a more malignant clinical progression in their illness. The recording stopped suddenly, so I'm just going to say talk about the poem again. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And for me, I just feel that I've come full circle in my own personal research, and that's where I am at. Oops. I have given my email address and I've just stopped sharing just before.